distinction, and there's a guy, Noah Radford, that has written his PhD on this, if you want to look up his stuff. That he does a really nice critique of talking through just exactly the way that they sort of play up the, the design of the glasses themselves, and the sort of way that they, sort of detail that gets put into these fictional pieces to tell a story. So that's the end of the, case studies that I found in design. In the 90s, I was an undergraduate student in an art school. They only had one design major, graphic design. And every day we tried to defend ourselves that we were not the sellouts by positioning graphic design as this admirable practice that was so distinctly different from a field like advertising, because of course the painters, etc., just lumped us with advertising. And we convinced ourselves that it was more ethical to design infographics for annual reports than it was to create watch ads for a magazine, or that designing cereal packaging was somehow far more honourable than directing a TV spot for Coca-Cola. A decade later, it was easy for me to see how thin our argument was, and yet the popular definition of design is as a profession within a capitalist context, as a service deployed by business and industry for the production of business communications and consumer goods. In the last 30 years, the definition has grown to include strategic planning and larger-scale systems thinking, but often still at the service of business. I could only dream of design playing an expanded role outside of that context. And yet, hopefully, as this last group of projects highlights, that when we use the speculative, multimodal, material, negotiative practice of design, we can do projects that I could have only once dreamed of. To me, these projects that I've shown are signals of what the future holds for design, the future that you get to craft. These designers proposing augmented technologies in a healthcare context, conceiving of reflective spaces for educating communities about the future impacts of climate change, constructing mediated space for co-designing with communities facing inevitable disasters, and designing concept cars based on radically rethinking the passenger's driving experience. It makes me pretty envious to be you, because I think it's a pretty exciting time to be shaping the potential of design. So this last section is me kind of reflecting on my own practice, hoping that this will also help you think of ways to interrogate your own work. And so my recent research essentially triangulates many of the ideas that we've discussed today. I didn't realise that I could store that all on fast forward. But so I don't think I can quickly show you those again. Those images I just flashed through, can I show them? No, not easily. Anyway, so what I was talking about is this practice of figuring, and which is the work that I used to do at Parsons. And you won't remember them because they flashed up too fast, but I basically started with a normal organisational chart, and we were thinking about how to restructure the schools that you're now in didn't used to exist, and there used to be just 12 different departments at Parsons, and we were working out how to restructure the departments into schools. And I started off with organisational charts, and that just made everyone worry about who they were reporting to, and then I kind of turned the organisational chart around. Sorry, I can't get back there. Tried to turn the organisational chart around to become more kind of organic, and then the final image was one of this really network distributed sort of sense of community, and that my point was that in figuring these diagrams and the discussions that we had around it totally changed the way that we sort of stopped worrying about, like reporting structures and started to talk about the kind of communities that we could create. And the reason that I also put in this image was to highlight that this was hardly a seamless process, that this was actually one of the working diagrams I showed very early on, and I'm showing it to just make perfectly clear how much cultural specificity comes from our lived experiences, because I could only put the slide up for about 2 seconds before all the Americans in the room laughed and said that I wasn't really suggesting that the future of Parsons could look like the shape of the Pentagon. So then that was the work that I used to do that was obviously embedded in my skills as a graphic designer. And then now I want to talk about why I work with Playmobiles instead of Illustrator. And comparing the sort of figuring the future stuff that I did for Parsons to this performing the future work that I've been recently doing. And as Clyde mentioned, this now focuses on design learning in a K-12 context, partly because I thought that if you were going to find a complex, far-reaching domain that was really in need of systemic change, you didn't need to look past K-12. So this most recent interdisciplinary project I collaborated on with Jackie Coxey, who was a recent graduate of the transdisciplinary program, and we began the project working with a social scientist. And the project basically traces a line between the process of designing scenario-based learning and 21st century competencies, and we were particularly looking at an idea of a sort of formative assessment for cross-curricular learning. And the project essentially is framed by this motivation that we wanted to design an integrated collaborative challenge that would the students would get to experience, and that would make them sort of step through a whole lot of the learning and innovation skills that are identified with 21st century stuff. So the assessment project consisted of a two-part exercise. But what is interesting for me here is to reflect on the work in the light of the examples I just presented, and to acknowledge the extent to which this whole project is part participatory design, part speculative design, and part design fiction. So part one was a 90-minute collaborative exercise where the participants were challenged to think critically and creatively while framing problems and proposing solutions. The methods were structured around a challenge that borrowed heavily from participatory design and did presume that all the students were non-designers. The challenge then begins with a future scenario that the students had to respond to, that was kind of like a near future fiction one, framing the speculative question of how they would design their future. The final task being a 3-act narrative that really underscored empathy and action by focusing on the question of impact as told through how people experience the intervention. And this is kind of key to why I think this is a very different way of working. The acts that we finally worked with required the group to Act 1, identify the problem, 2, introduce their intervention, and 3, propose the impact it would have. The framing of this 21st century skills challenge around future scenarios speaks to the importance to me of learning how we navigate the future. Hopefully you already appreciate that the opportunity you have to imagine tomorrow's future is pretty exciting work. But I also hope that this course has taught you to see the socio-political and ethical importance of this project. For us Bell underscores here, one way people can become more responsible actors in the world is by learning how to search more fully for possible futures, to forecast probable futures more accurately, and to make judgments of preferable futures more objectively. And this was the idea that we wanted to instill in high school students, the sense of agency that they can make their own future. So borrowing from design fiction's use of narrative and telling the story of potential and impact through the video, the outcome of this was just a 2-minute video sketch that they produced in this kind of rapid fire 20 minutes. And it's tempting for me to say that this new body of work is all about a designer's mindset, that's more about how a designer thinks than makes. And yet that would be for me to ignore how distinctly different this practice might be from the social science equivalent of role-playing. It is true that even from the outset it is framed differently, that it's all about taking action and proposing an intervention, considering the potential. But what can't be ignored is that even if this work requires a different level of craft, it is still very much an approach based on what we can learn from making. Because for me, the discursive value of ambiguity built into material artefacts is exactly what enables the designer to engage a peer community to co-create the future with us. If you think of Yoko's bushfire project, the productive way that the multimodal discussions, they were using sharks and action figures and stuff, can open up interpretations and advance the potential of a tentative idea speaks to a very specific asset that designers bring to an interdisciplinary collaboration. This video was done by my research assistants, Christopher Patton and Maggie Olov, in response to what they have taken away from the original research project. This is an edited version, so you can't hear the script, but they were inquisitive as to whether the video itself could provide a platform for reflection on their own learning, which is why I've cut the video right here, where the students sit down to reflect on the insights they take away from this co-creation method. At this point, I find it pretty interesting to look back on the previous way I figured futures, the diagrams, versus the performing future strategy I now adopt. 5 years ago, I would have literally shuddered to have stood in front of you making a case for co-designing strategies that I perceived dismissed my expertise as graphic designer. But also 5 years ago, I only tacitly understood what the designer's way of thinking through making offers to a research collaboration. Today, I'm struck by how the material act of telling the story differently, using people instead of abstract diagrams, predictably yet profoundly changed the questions I ask. The diagrams that led me to ask questions like, what might we do, what might this look like? In contrast, the human-centered approach asked me to question, how might this be experienced? What would this be the impact on communities? I can now see that this playing with ready-made materials is still all about designing. Just this time, it's crafting spaces for collaboration, making spaces for interaction, and ultimately about designing spaces for action. And in conclusion, I thought that when I began this talk, that my little aside at the beginning was just that, a distraction from what I really wanted to talk about. But of course, I was wrong, because that's not quite true. For when you think of the importance of the decisions we make, the methods we adopt, the critical perspectives we bring to prototype in the future, it is evident that we need to not make the people abstractions, as I did in my early Parsons diagrams. For what is most offensive about a learning experience that ignores the lived experiences of the majority of the people in the room is that we whitewash over the critical importance of learning how, as designers, to consider a situation as it impacts people of different ages, race, sexual orientation, class, and ethnicity. So as you go into your recitations, I want you to stop and ask the questions that I have had to ask myself about my practice as it evolves. And ask yourself, what would you do? What would you need to change about the way you make, the way you learn, and the way you act in the world? Because everyone in this room knows that you guys are actually the artists and designers that will define this half of the century. So let's make sure that we carefully prototype our future. Thank you.
We've got 5 or 10 minutes left if anybody's got any questions for Lisa. Loads of stuff here. So.
I was asking you before, why do you think it is that we're, we are have this, you show them getting all white males. Well, maybe it's the black. Yeah.
Maybe I have to answer that question. And it just, it's worse because it comes out of thoughtlessness. It just comes out, it just happens. The people you think of, the people who you sort of think of, oh yeah, I'll ask so-and-so to give you a lecture. The readings I know, the texts I'm familiar with, just without me even thinking about it once. And I remember that last year was a real embarrassment when they pointed out, and I swore to myself I would change. And then gradually you start doing it and you think about actually, I'll finish up with this again. I shouldn't have been bad to this. Then you would have been all right about it. So I have to plead really guilty here. But it's a kind of, it just shows you how kind of literally ingrained it is. It's just, it is literally without thought. So that it's my thoughtlessness, which is doesn't excuse me. That's where it comes from, like an intention.
I would add to that Clyde's made the point of the papers that he knows, because I have to concede that that for me doing this, I knew that I was doing this. So I spent a lot more time trying to find projects done by women. I took a lot more time trying to find, projects done by different ethnicities and stuff. And so what I think is interesting is that I even reflected whilst I was doing it, that if I was to do the version of this for my PhD, it wouldn't look that different to the slides at the beginning, to be honest. And yet, when I was doing my PhD, the texts that I would find by women that had written about design research, which were few and far between, I always liked them more. And so I think that the thing that is sort of hard to acknowledge is that it is, when Clyde talks about the people that he thinks to, invite and stuff, it's like, I was recently asked to chair, to organise and chair a panel on design research in Vancouver. And I had to make myself think of a male to invite, because all the people I immediately thought of were women whose work I liked. And then I thought, do I have to invite a male, or is it okay for me to take the position of my, feminist studies professor that said, no, we're just going to read, And in the end, the male dropped out, and we had this panel of all women, and then it was interesting how many people that wrote afterwards commented on how amazing it felt to see 4 women standing there talking about their research projects, and so I think that there is, and I'm not saying in that case I wasn't choosing them as explicitly as I was here. I was choosing them because these are the people I had a conversation with, and they're often talking in a different way than when I'm talking to than the conversations that I have with white males. And so I sort of feel like that it is, it's entrenched, but it's entrenched also because there's kind of, different conversations resonate with us, different ways of kind of reading. And so I think what's hard in this sort of context is that it does take in on Clive's and my part, for me, the literature around design research is a very white male literature, and because there are more females, practicing. And so I think that, I think there's that consciousness of having to seek it out is the thing. It's not necessarily going to resonate for you.
I think I'm going to have to employ a good researcher. If somebody wants a job. I mean, there's another, for us, there's another, which was brought up last year as well, and I've been trying to figure out how to deal with this problem. One of the students last year brought up a very good point. For a lot of the students in this audience from Asia would actually learn something which looked at Asian philosophies and emerging Asian design philosophies and tried to relate those to, and that we've actually badly need to do this. And again, it was something I actually mentioned to people, look, we need to really try and look for a faculty who could actually do this. And it's another of those things which went back to default, but this is really, I've got that in the back of my mind that we really ought to have some kind of, at least a seminar workshop which actually began to actually look at this. It's a rather important thing. So there are ways in which we have to deal with this. I mean, part of the other problem here, and this is a serious question here, is that we are so used to the studio model, or studio and a kind of little bit of theory or history kind of put over here, which is sort of rather nominal and rather academic. And what we still haven't got axiomatic in a design school is like that people would think it was important to have some kind of workshop that looked at this. Frankly, one of my worries about doing second generation courses of this, you might call it sort of DFCT2 or something, where you could look at it, is that I'm not sure anybody would want to actually turn up and do it. So one's actually also trying to build a student audience for these possible arenas. I'm thinking there especially the thing about trying to look at Asian design philosophies, white versus Western philosophies and so on, actually kind of look at that one. But the gender one, we're really going to have to. Okay, now I'm just too embarrassed to do this again. I'm not going through this a third time. That would be really embarrassing.
Well, I think what's
so either you're not coming next year, or I've got to solve this.
And what's interesting is that last year I really totally let Clive off the hook, because I referred to how systemically it was a problem within New School and the hierarchy of the institution, and then I compared the US to Australia and how US is like 32nd in the world or something in terms of a place for women to work, and versus Australia was number 2 in the world, and so I was like explaining these sorts of things, and then this year I thought, no, I'm not going to let him off the hook. I'm going to make it sound like it's all about here, but of course it is a systemic problem. Yes.
Do you mind talking a bit about the collab you're teaching next semester?
Yeah, well, it's directly related to this. So it's with Mozilla, and I know very little about technology, and the person that I'm teaching with, Xing Wei, she works for New Visions, which is a division of the city, the New York City around education, and the area that sort of really looks at innovative sort of pockets of innovation and stuff, and so schools like Quest to Learn were part of established by New Visions, and she approached Mozilla, and we talked about what sort of foresight planning and sort of near future work could we do with Mozilla, and because she was obviously really knows the sort of gaming and technology piece well, and then I more from what we were talking about, knew the sort of more the design fiction and the scenario work, and what they acknowledged is that